Welcome back to New Rockstars. I'm Erik Voss, and this is a breakdown of the Book of Boba Fett Episode 2, From Train Trippin' to Lizard Trippin'. This entire episode was a glorious vision that I am going to break down shot by shot for all the Easter eggs and visual details that you might have missed. And thank you to Baksu for sponsoring this video. More on them later. We open gliding up the cracked path leading to the palace of Jabba the Hutt, the same path 3PO and R2 walked up early on in Return of the Jedi, but now Fennec Shand escorts that captured assassin. The gates creak open, as we saw when Luke passed under them. These gates designed with teeth shapes that make it look like you're entering into the giant gaping maw of a beast. Now this assassin is played by Paul Darnell, a longtime stunt performer who actually doubled for Timothy Oliphant in The Mandalorian. Meanwhile, the Gamorreans are played by Colin Himes, longtime stunt actor and stunt driver, and Frank Trigg, veteran MMA fighter. The assassin swears at Boba in Huttese. Ichuta! Ichuta is a general Huttese insult, roughly for piss off or F you, which are also standard greetings in New York. We actually first heard this from a protocol droid to 3PO in Cloud City and Empire.
Oh, nice to see a familiar face. Ichuta. How rude.
But we also heard a version of this in the first episode of The Mandalorian.
Ichuta, Mando.
Now, at the time, some fans thought that they were changing the meaning of this profanity to a general aggressive greeting, but if you listen closely, that guy did say Achuta, and now you can hear this assassin really accentuate the E.
Ichuta.
Matt Berry, voicing Jabba's torture droid 8D8, returns.
He is of the Order of the Night Wind.
The Night Wind is a new group previously unheard of in Star Wars, but there was a pirate freighter named the Night Wind in the 90s role-playing game. But then Fennec says,
perhaps he fears the Rancor.
yes, it is a Rancor head carving on that throne where Fennec hits that switch, and 4 more Rancor carvings are on the base of the throne as it rolls forward for a better view, as it did with Jabba. But remember, Jabba had a different button on his armrest that he pushed, so these new armrests must have been installed by Bib Fortuna. The assassin falls through the same trapdoor that Luke does, rolling down into the dungeon, and I love how the moment she said Rancor, those Gamorreans cleared the hell out of the way. Now on the other side of the Rancor pit, you can see that gate with the inner door raised and that red and green lit panel just as Luke left it in Return of the Jedi. But there is no Rancor here since of course Luke killed the Rancor with the heavier gate crashing down on its head, but no backup Rancor despite Fennec mentioning a menagerie and despite Mochi being recovered by Bib Fortuna in Bad Batch. All we get is a little rodent just like the ones 3PO saw in Jabba's dungeon. So as Boba leads the assassin back into town to face the mayor, they're glared at by a number of Trandoshans. Despite that Trandoshan leader's tribute last episode, clearly this family did not expect Boba to survive the day. And then after being given some nonverbal ichutas by the clerk and then by Pasquazi returning as a Twi'lek majordomo, they meet the Mos Espa mayor, Mok Shaiz, an Ithorian race voiced by series director Robert Rodriguez.
He's a member of the Order of the Night Wind.
As he talks through his neck orifices, those sounds are received by a mouthpiece that translates through the apparatus that rests atop his head. Just love the puppeteering here. We actually first saw an Ithorian in the cantina in the 1977 Star Wars, and here it looks like the designers give Mok Shaiz more wrinkles and fuzzy whiskers, puffier eyes, all to give him a more aged look. Mok Shaiz and his guards all wear a matching golden medallion with the same signet. It does bear a bit of resemblance to the signet of the Hutt clan, but it's not exact. Maybe it's upside down. It's also a bit like the tattoo on the male Hutt's chin. Either way, this mayor is still more loyal to the Hutts than to this assumed interim boss, and he advises,
running a family is more complicated than bounty hunting.
Ah yes, the theme of this series, and Boba's hidden weapon. Because everyone assumes Boba still needs to learn this lesson, but in reality, as we see in the flashback does, he knows way more about family than all these crooked Hutts who were born into their dynasty do. Back in the Sanctuary Cantina, the RX series droid deals some cards. This is the same kind of droid as RX-24 from Star Tours and Rex from Ogus Cantina. But sitting around this table are a Shadra fan, and then this dipshit who looks like his daughter used a Sharpie to draw some Darth Maul tattoos on his face. Boba chats with Garsa Fwip.
Now you're sweating like a Gumpton Mustafa.
Yeah, I guess this is the Star Wars equivalent of, forgive me, but sweating like a whore in church. Gumpta, as far as I know, is not a word we've heard in Star Wars, but yes, of course, Mustafar, the volcanic planet where Obi-Wan fought Anakin and where Vader built his castle, and that castle was built on the grounds of a Sith temple, making this a kind of church for him. Garza says that the twins have claimed Jabba's turf, despite Boba's assumption that they were partying it up on Hutta, referring to Nal Hutta, the Hutt's home world. Max Rebo's band cuts out as the drums of the Hutts litter adventure approach. And outside the hut, twins are carried in on their litter, their immense weight sagging the platform in the middle. I love how the poor carriers just look like they're struggling more and more throughout the scene. Now, these huts have an aquarium snack bowl like Jabba would often have. And that male hut has a cage off to the side containing a rodent that he later uses to mop up his sweat. Based on that rodent's antenna, it looks like the same kind of rodent that was swallowed up by the wart outside of Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi. Nearby, the gawkers include some Jawas and a Hask in a bikini top. Hot. The huts unveil this massive Wookiee in gladiator armor. This is Black Krrsantan, a bounty hunter from the 2015 Darth Vader comics and the 2016 Dr. Aphra stories. He once worked for Jabba alongside Boba Fett when they both took gigs from Darth Vader, meaning these two have a shared history. Later on, he worked for the scoundrel archaeologist Dr. Aphra, a badass Indiana Jones-like figure of the Star Wars universe who may now show up in live action. Krrsantan's backstory was that he was a Kashyyyk outcast who ended up with the slavers, the Zanti brothers, who injected metal into his knuckles to make him a fiercer gladiator. And then during his time with Jabba the Hutt, around the year 10 BBY, this is a year before the Obi-Wan Kenobi series will be set, Krrsantan took Owen Lars hostage on Tatooine and ended up getting scarred in a battle with Ben Kenobi, events that we may now see on the Obi-Wan Kenobi series coming later this year. And if you look closely, you can see the slightly pinkish region above the right eye where Obi-Wan's lightsaber burned him, and in addition to the metal in his knuckles, Krrsantan wears some spiked brass knuckles over his fingers. Boba Fett scoffs,
You can bring as many gladiators as you wish, but these are not the deathbeds of Dur, and I am not a sleeping Trandoshan god.
Yes, Dur is another new bit of Star Wars lore, apparently some planet that hosted gladiator combat, and Boba is recalling some memory from Krrsantan's past where he just got lucky with a sleeping Trandoshan, an insult to this great gladiator. And Boba's also insulting all the nearby Trandoshans that he just passed. They're definitely within earshot. After they leave, Fennec says,
They're huts. We would have to get permission if you want to kill them.
permission from whom? These rules cast the Hutts as untouchable crime bosses like captains in La Cosa Nostra. This mysterious boss of bosses may be Kira, who was Maul's number 2 after Dryden Voss's death in Solo: A Star Wars Story, within that Crimson Dawn crime organization, which during Clone Wars Maul created out of the Shadow Collective, which included the Hutts along with the Pike Syndicate, who we see in this episode, and other groups like the Black Sun and the Death Watch, which later became the same Watch clan that the Mandalorian Din Djarin was a part of. Now, Maul, of course, died in his rematch with Kenobi shortly before the A New Hope events, so Kira would now be the head of the Crimson Dawn. Emilia Clarke will appear on another Disney Plus series, Secret Invasion, so she's already part of the family. She could totally show up in a Star Wars series too. Another flashback that shows Boba's time with the Tuskens. Now he's got an intermediary stick, showing he's working his way up that hierarchy. They dig up one of those creatures I brought up before, a wart, that toad-like beast that we saw in Return of the Jedi. And then we hear this roar from the horizon. Now, this is the train of the Pike Syndicate, but this roar sounds a lot like the sound effect that they use for the Krayt Dragon. So I'm wondering if the Pikes might blare this sound as a siren to scare off the Tuskens the same way Ben Kenobi used the sound of a Krayt Dragon to scare people away from Luke. But either way, it's interesting how the Tuskens fear this Pike train the same way the people of Mos Pelgo fear the Krayt Dragon. And this relationship between the Pikes and the Tuskens is mirrored directly from the history of the American West, when the expansion of the Transcontinental Railroad was devastating both to the indigenous tribes and to the American bison, which trained travelers would just fire at from the trains for sport and leave the carcasses to rot. Like, until now, Star Wars stories have always cast Tuskens as Tusken Raiders and Sand People, the other. But this series follows The Mandalorian Chapter 9 by recasting the Tuskens as sympathetic people with their own culture, their own humanity. And you see this with this Pike train literally firing the first shot unprovoked, killing a bantha. Afterwards, the Tuskens burn their dead on a funeral pyre, evoking Jedi funeral pyres, one of the many ways this episode actually parallels Tusken spirituality with Jedi mysticism. Boba tracks down those Nikto Raiders that we saw in episode 1 when they attacked the moisture farm to this Toshi station. This is the same location as we saw in the deleted sequence from the 1977 Star Wars when Luke met up with Biggs. The interior was totally recreated perfectly with even that same electronic game that they play in that scene, and inside is Cammy Marstrap and Lay's Fixer Lonozer. These are Luke's friends from that scene. You remember Cammy? She called him Wormy. I love how they even kept the late 70s hairstyles. This is amazing. You know, I've been breaking down these kind of things for years now, and to keep me going, I like to have some snacks within reach. The problem is, I've just kind of gotten tired of the same old snacks. I've been curious about mixing up some snacking with some new flavors, and if you're like me, you should give Baksu a try. Thanks to Baksu for sponsoring this video. Baksu is a monthly subscription service that delivers premium Japanese snacks and tea pairings straight from Japan to your door. Each themed monthly Baksu box takes you on a gourmet journey through Japan. Baksu is the only company that partners with 100-year-old family snack makers for genuine and authentic selections. The first Baksu you will receive is called Seasons of Japan. Look, it comes loaded with snacks here, and this booklet that walks you through it all. Not to brag, but I have actually been to Japan, and I had an incredible trip visiting my brother, and some of these snacks are just really taking me back. Yay! This is the Aomori apple caramel cookie. It's made in the apple growing region of Japan and has a soft and chewy texture that the Japanese call yakoi. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, but I'm not enjoying this cookie. You don't get these kind of flavors from snacks in the US. The Baksu box just makes for a really cool gift for that anime fan or travel lover in your life. Click the link in the description and use our code Rockstars to get 10% off your subscription. Now notice how on the back of these Nikto's vests is Arabesh translating to the word Tatooine, and they got a crest that looks like a skeleton with long arms reaching down to the sides, clutching some bounty. Just comes off like a pirate flag, which these guys pretty much are. And you'll notice the back of that crest is formed by the mirrored L shape that they mark on the moisture farm. It also marks all their speeder bikes along with that same skeleton crest. It's kind of like the way biker gangs like the Hells Angels wear clothes marked with what part of the country they're from. So I'm guessing these guys are just the Tatooine division of whatever this bigger Nikto gang is. And one of the Niktos that Boba hits has more Orabesh at the bottom of his back, translating to Emmett. Oh, they're like jerseys. Also a reminder of Emmett Brown, who gets another interesting sort of homage later in this episode. Now, as Boba tows those speeder bikes back to the Tuskens, one of those bikes has Tatooine written in Orabesh again on the side. Look, I'm doing my best to translate all the Orabesh I can this episode because that holo tablet was just too out of focus to read, and I feel guilt that I can't translate it. Use my mission to translate all of it for you. I'm sorry. I love this. The Tuskens dismantle the bikes.
Whoa, stop, no, come on. These are mine, stop. These are mine.
I love that final delayed toss by the Tusken in the back. Well, it's in my hand. I don't want to hold it anymore. Onto the amazing train attack, which feels so intense because in the opening throws, so many Tuskens go down. And you can see how this weighs on Boba in this awesome over-the-shoulder reaction, which makes him vulnerable to the shot that damages his engine. So now Boba has to totally shift his objective. He pulls the brakes to grab that falling Tusken and then swings both of them from the grappling rope right as the bike explodes. This is just great action filmmaking here. And right as these Tuskens are caught in the crossfire, the female warrior notices that Boba's car is now being swarmed without his knowledge by more pikes coming in from behind. So what does she do? She rams her bike into that car behind in order to cork the swarm. But then this alerts that super anxious conductor droid who directs fuel from the core, that's the Orabesh written up top, to the boost, that's the Orabesh written below, like it's freaking Doc Brown throwing the yellow fuel log on. This droid is nuts. It even has one eye pointing down like a psycho, and then just uses all four of its hands to crank up the speed. Now, while the amazing Steph Green directed this episode, the DP was veteran cinematographer Dean Cunley, who shot the Back to the Future train finale, and all three Back to the Future films actually shot a lot of movies you love. So this whole train sequence plus the Emmett shout out, I feel like that's intentional enough. I love how we get a terrifying sense of scale for this increased speed when that female warrior boards the car and smacks out a pipe. Yeah, great Indiana Jones style whip crack punch sound effect there, and then immediately when that pike hits the ground, he zips out of frame. So to stop the train, Boba has to use his gaffy stick to pry the lever back, using the traditional Tusken tool to overpower the far more advanced tech. And we should say this whole train sequence definitely feels like an homage to Lawrence of Arabia, a major influence on George Lucas's generation of filmmakers, and also memorably included a train attack that won this stranger in the strange land the respect of the local tribes. Afterwards, Boba addresses the pikes who try to play dumb about spice.
What do you mean by spice?
Sansana spice from the slave mines of Kessel.
Yes, the Pike Syndicate runs the spice mines on Kessel. We actually saw this in Solo when that Pike was still wearing the mask, but this is the first time I think that we have seen a Pike unmasked in live action, because in the animated series we saw them without their masks, and now you can see how beneath these headpieces, their features are actually pretty aquatic. Similar in nature, at least, to the Mon Calamari, the Quarrens, which would explain their fear of dehydration in the desert and their need to wear masks to protect them from this atmosphere, and why they had a whole car full of water. But then spice dumps out of the crate and it glitters in the air. And of course, spice is a term for drugs, which was one of the many world details that George Lucas pulled directly from Frank Herbert's Dune. Parallels that now seem super obvious since Denis Villeneuve's Dune, and it depicts this hallucinogenic spice melange in a very similar way. So Boba makes the Pikes walk to Anchorhead, telling them to walk in a single file, as Tuskens always do to hide their numbers. The Tusken chieftain later explains, according to the Ultimate Star Wars book, Tatooine was once covered by vast oceans and lush rainforest, but in current canon, it was dried out through some unknown means. Though in earlier Legends literature, this was a result of the Rakatans, who bombed the hell out of the planet. It's still yet to be known what caused it in main Star Wars canon, but it does seem like whatever happened, the Tuskens and the Jawas withstood this climate change. Just a fascinating bit of history that redefines these tribes as true post-apocalyptic survivors. And then the chieftain's got a lizard that crawls up Boba's nose. Yeah, I love the echo on the chieftain's final word as Boba spirals and has a bad trip, or the best ever trip, because he walks across the Dune Sea, which crashes up in ocean waves. His body is superimposed with his armor both on and off, and storm clouds thunder behind him. Just some brilliant elemental contrast here. The Dune Sea of dry sand, his new home, ebbing into the oceans of Kamino, his birthplace. And then he finds this pair of trees on the dune ahead, or is it a wave of water? We never see vegetation on the planet of Tatooine, but this elusive gaffy tree must exist somewhere for him to have gotten his branch, and only the lizard knows where. Trees are hugely significant to Force mysticism. Jedi trees were considered beacons of Force sensitivity, carefully cultivated underneath Jedi temples. A tree was actually used to shelter a temple on Ahch-To when Luke lived there. This lizard could actually be considered an animalistic equivalent to Morai, the owl guide for Ahsoka Tano. Of course, Tuskens are not Jedi, and they don't at all subscribe to those dogmatic religious beliefs, but the Force is real. It's an energy that surrounds and binds all living things, including the Tuskens, so the lizard and these trees could just be their mystical interpretation of the same thing. And this natural imagery also evokes Luke's deconstructed description of the Force in The Last Jedi.
It's the energy between all things, a tension, a balance that binds the universe together. What do you see?
The island. Life. Death and decay that feeds new life. Warmth. Cold. Peace. Violence.
And notice how in the branches of this tree, we see a number of pairs of red eyes. In the concept art that rolls during the credits, these were meant to be Jawas, which is super interesting to me because Jawas, alongside Tuskens, are the only native sentient beings to this planet. And this tree may represent a historic peace between these two tribes, perhaps the original tribes of Tatooine of this episode's title, one tall tree, one small tree, representing the tall Tuskens and the shorter Jawas. And then as the branches wrap around him, they cross-dissolve into the innards of the Sarlacc, which Boba was not unarmored as he crawled out of last episode. So this reframes that slimy emergence as a metaphorical birth for his character. It's gross to think about, but it is the most natural thing in the world, folks. And throughout this process, we get some awesome superimpositions. The shot of Boba holding Jango's helmet, newly shot for the series, dissolves into Boba's adult face in that helmet. Boba, as a child, witnesses his father departing Kamino, leaving him behind, and in that ship reflection on the window, appears on his cheek in the shape of a teardrop, and then his child hand reaching out to his father, dissolving into the adult hand reaching up out of the sand. And then at this point, Boba snaps the branch, which cuts to an explosion of waves, metaphorically snapping the umbilical cord, leashing him to his incubated state of his biological lineage through Jango. He is no longer just a Jango clone, he has his own identity achieved through the Tuskens. And so they finally reclothe Boba from his undergarments to more traditional Tusken robes with some awesome music. Ludwig Göransson composed the main themes of the show, but all this music was actually composed by his colleague Joseph Shirley, who mixes these deep vocal chanting to imbue this moment with sacred reverence. The shots of him getting robed here also mirror his getting armored up in episode 1. For him, now, his Boba Fett armor is really an extension of his Tusken identity. They guide him to carve his branch into a true ornate gaffy stick. And what I love about this process is that the lizard is no longer in his brain, whereas the location in the retrieval of the branch was a subconscious ritual. Its weaponization must be conscious and done by his own hand. And if you think about it, it's another Jedi parallel. As a rite of passage, Jedi must construct their own lightsabers using kyber crystals that they retrieve from the natural world. And this whole armory set was inspired directly from original art by Ralph McQuarrie in 1977 depicting his designs for the Sand People of Tatooine. I love how they brought back in that curved piece of scrap hull. So cool. Yet still, this whole process is not complete until he returns to the campfire to obtain the approval of the chieftain and join the others in the ceremonial dance. Because it's not about the lone warrior on a solo introspective journey, it's about coming back from that journey to become a member of a tribe and joining them in the dance. I love this episode so much. I can't wait to keep breaking down this series with you. So you can support New Rockstars by checking out our merch options at newrockstarsmerch.com. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at EA Voss. Follow New Rockstars. Subscribe to New Rockstars for more analysis of everything you love. Thanks for watching, Boba.